I jolted awake to the jarring clang of metal chains rattling outside my bedroom window, the clock on my nightstand glaring 5:15 a.m., way too early for anything honest. My stomach twisted into knots as I flung off the covers and stumbled to the window. Through the misty haze hovering over the lake, I spotted the shadowy outline of a tow truck creeping down our serene lakeside road, its yellow hazard lights blinking through the fog like a sinister warning. I knew exactly what they were after. Throwing on a robe, I bolted barefoot down the stairs and burst through the back door just as a burly tow operator stepped onto my private dock, chains in hand, eyeing my 26F Monterey cabin cruiser that rocked gently in the water. That boat, aptly named Freedom, had been my treasure since inheriting this lakefront slice of heaven from my Uncle Charles 8 months ago. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice slicing through the morning quiet. "You're trespassing on private property." The operator froze, one foot on the dock, one on the shore. "Got orders to remove an unauthorized vessel," he muttered, waving a work order with Homeowners Association authorization stamped across it. "You're not touching my boat," I shot back, striding closer. "This is my property, land and dock." He looked uncertain, glancing back toward the road where his truck idled, and that's when I saw it, a silver Mercedes with a custom plate reading Harboss rolling up. My heart sank. Francine Westbrook, the Homeowners Association president herself, had arrived to... Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any confrontations with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Oversee my humiliation. I watched as Francine emerged from her luxury car clipboard, in hand, dressed immaculately. Despite the early hour, her heels clicked against the pavement as she strode toward us with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. "Mr. Harrington," she called out, not bothering to hide the smugness in her voice. "We've given you ample notice. The board voted unanimously. No boats may be docked in residential waterfront areas. It diminishes property values and creates an eyesore. This is ridiculous," I countered, feeling my face flush with anger. "You have no jurisdiction over my dock or my boat." Francine's thin smile didn't waver. "Perhaps you failed to read the covenant you signed when you took possession of this property. The Lakeside Heights Homeowners Association governs all aspects of community aesthetics, including waterfront views." She nodded to the tow operator. "Proceed, please." The man squared his shoulders and moved toward my boat again. That's when I remembered the folder I'd left on my kitchen counter last night, the culmination of 3 weeks of research, legal consultations, and visits to the county records office. I held up one finger. "Give me 30 seconds, I said. Then dashed back into my house. When I returned, I carried a leather portfolio containing what had cost me $2,000 in legal fees and countless hours combing through property records. Francine's eyes narrowed as I approached. "Before you touch my property," I said calmly, opening the folder. "I thought you might want to see these." I pulled out a stack of documents, each one sealed in an official envelope with eviction notice stamped across the front. In bold red letters, I handed one to Francine and another to the tow operator, whose eyebrows shot up in confusion. "What is this nonsense?" Francine demanded, her voice losing its composure for the first time. That I said, "Feeling a surge of confidence is an official notice informing the Lakeside Heights Homeowners Association that they are unlawfully encroaching on private repair, Aryan property rights. In other words, Francine, you're being evicted from my lake." The morning stillness suddenly felt electric. The tower took a cautious step backward, and I knew in that moment that the game had changed entirely. 8 months earlier, I never could have imagined myself in this position after 20 years of working in corporate finance in the city. The unexpected inheritance from my Uncle Charles had seemed like a gift from heaven, a charming 3-bedroom, lakefront, property in Lakeside Heights, a peaceful community. About 90 minutes from the urban sprawl I'd called home for most of my adult life, the lawyer handling Charles's estate had explained that my uncle had left me everything: the house, the property, and even his old fishing gear in the shed out back. What neither of us fully understood at the time was just how significant those property rights would become. My first few weeks at the lake house were idyllic. I spent mornings on the back porch. With coffee, watching her stalk the shallows. Afternoons were for small home improvement projects or exploring the lake in a small rowboat I'd found in the boathouse. In the evenings, I'd grill fresh fish on the deck and watch the sunset paint the water in shades of amber and gold. For the first time in decades, I felt at peace. The Homeowners Association seemed like a minor inconvenience at first. Yes, there were rules about lawn height and trash can, placement, approved paint colors, and mailbox styles, but these were common in upscale communities, and the neighborhood was undeniably beautiful, pristine, and picturesque, with every home maintaining a certain standard of appearance. Everything changed when I decided to buy the boat with my retirement fund fully vested and a generous severance package from my former employer. I'd finally purchased the cabin cruiser I'd dreamed of since childhood. Freedom was modest by luxury boat standards, but she was perfect for lake life, large enough for overnight trips, but small enough to manage alone the day I brought her home, and docked behind my house. I noticed curtains twitching in neighboring windows. By that evening, an envelope had been slipped into my mailbox, my first official warning. From the Lakeside Heights Homeowners Association. Dear resident, it began in stiff, formal language. It has come to our attention that an unauthorized vessel has been docked at your property as per Bylaw 7.3 revised last quarter. No watercraft exceeding 16 ft may be permanently moored at residential docks within Lakeside Heights. Please remove said vessel within 72 hours or face penalties as outlined in the covenant agreement. I read the letter twice. Baffled by its audacity, the boat was docked in the water behind my own home, not parked on the street or in my driveway. Surely they couldn't dictate what I did with my own waterfront. The next morning, I called the number listed at the bottom of the letter and reached Deborah, the association secretary. When I explained my confusion, her response was coolly efficient. The bylaw was updated 3 months ago. Mr. Harrington, the board, voted unanimously to restrict boat sizes for aesthetic and environmental reasons. All residents received notification of the proposed changes. I only moved in 2 months ago. I reminded her the covenant transfers with the property. She replied without missing a beat. Your signing of the deed constitutes acceptance of all Homeowners Association bylaws, including amendments, but it's my private dock. I pressed. The water behind my house is part of Cedar Lake, she interrupted, which is subject to community standards as established by the Lakeside Heights Governing Board. The initial fine is $150 per day. Beginning after the 72-hour grace period, this increases to $300 after the first week of non-compliance. I hung up the phone, feeling like I'd been ambushed. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office and requested copies of my property deed and any associated covenants. The clerk, an elderly woman named Martha, who'd apparently worked there since the Nixon administration, raised an eyebrow when I mentioned Lakeside Heights. That Westbrook woman was in here last month, she remarked as she pulled my file, making quite a fuss about water rights and easements. Never seen someone so concerned about other people's property. I spent 3 hours combing through the documents, most of which confirmed what Deborah had told me. The Homeowners Association did indeed have broad powers to regulate the appearance of the community, and I had technically agreed to abide by their rules when I accepted the property, but something felt off about their claim to regulate the waterfront. I decided to ignore the warning letter, hoping it was simply an overzealous interpretation that wouldn't be enforced. I was wrong. Exactly 73 hours after receiving the first notice, another envelope appeared, this one containing a fine notice for $150 and a second warning. 3 days after that, a third notice arrived along with a formal complaint about ongoing violations of community standards. When I ran into my next-door neighbor, Hank Peterson, while collecting my mail, I mentioned the escalating notices. Watch yourself with Francine in that board, he warned in a hushed tone, glancing around as if worried about being overheard. Last year they forced the Michael Elsons on Lakeview Drive to tear down a gazebo they'd built for their daughter's wedding, claimed it violated height restrictions. The thing is, they just didn't like how it looked from the golf course. That's absurd. I said, didn't anyone fight back, Hank? Shrugged. People try. But Francine's husband is a lawyer, and the association has deep pockets. Most folks just cave. It's easier that way. What about the lake itself? I pressed. Do they really control the water? A strange look crossed Hank's face. Funny you should ask. There was some dispute about that years ago. Before my time, something about the original land grants and water rights. But Francine always claims the association has final say over everything. You can see from the clubhouse that conversation planted a seed. I began researching riparian rights, the legal framework governing land adjacent to water bodies. Most evenings after work, I'd sit at my kitchen table with legal websites open on my laptop, making notes and connecting dots. Meanwhile, the fines continued to accumulate. 2 weeks after the initial notice, my total had reached $1,500, and the Homeowners Association had escalated to sending certified letters demanding payment and compliance. Then, 23 days after I docked Freedom at my lake house, I found something taped to her hull when I returned from grocery shopping, a fluorescent orange notice that made my blood run cold. Notice of impending removal. Unauthorized vessel will be towed at owner's expense in 24 hours, pursuant to HOA bylaw enforcement. They were actually going to take my boat that evening. I made 2 calls. The first was to a property rights attorney named Sarah Jeff, who agreed to meet me first thing in the morning. The second was to the county assessor's office, where I left a message requesting an urgent appointment regarding historical property boundaries. At Cedar Lake, I barely slept that night, alternating between rage at the Homeowners Association's overreach and anxiety about potentially losing my boat. By dawn, I had resolved that whatever happened, I would not go down without a fight. The meeting with Sarah proved to be the turning point. After reviewing my documents for half an hour, she looked up with a gleam in her eye. "Your uncle was quite thorough," she said, tapping a yellow document I hadn't fully understood. "This isn't just a standard property deed. Charles Harrington purchased extended riparian rights to 50 yards of lakefront extending from his property line in 1978, before the Homeowners Association even existed." What does that mean exactly? I asked, heart racing. "It means," Sarah explained, leaning forward, "that while the Homeowners Association may control land-based aesthetics, they have absolutely no jurisdiction over your dock or anything more to it." The water rights were deed separately from the community covenants and supersede any homeowners association. Bylaws. My afternoon at the county assessor's office confirmed Sarah's assessment. The original survey maps clearly showed that my uncle had indeed secured exclusive riparian rights to his section of lakefront rights that had transferred to me along with the property. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah helped me draft a series of legal notices, essentially eviction orders, informing the Homeowners Association that they were attempting to exercise authority over property they did not control. We documented every instance of their attempted overreach, calculated damages for harassment, and outlined the legal Consequences should they proceed with their towing threat. Will this really work? I asked Sarah as she notarized the documents. They're banking on residents not knowing their rights. She replied, most people just pay the fines because fighting seems too complicated, but your uncle's foresight has given you leverage they won't expect. When I returned home that evening, I noticed something I hadn't seen before as I was organizing. Uncle Charles's old desk, I found a small leather journal tucked in the back of a drawer. Inside, my uncle had meticulously documented his own battle with an earlier version of the Homeowners Association dating back to the late 1970s purchased, extended riparian rights. Today, one entry from October 1978 read, Hamilton tried to block it, claiming the association should control all lakefront access, but the county recorder confirmed my right to buy cost me an extra $4.00, but worth every penny for the freedom it will bring. No committee will ever tell me where I can fish or dock my boat. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, feeling a deep connection to the uncle I'd always admired, but never fully understood. Charles had been fighting this battle 4 decades ago, anticipating that someday these rights would matter, whether he knew they would pass to me or simply wanted to protect his own freedom. His foresight had provided the perfect defense when I needed it most. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my dock until nearly midnight, watching moonlight ripple across the water, thinking about Uncle Charles and the legacy he'd left me. It wasn't just the property, it was the example of standing up for what was rightfully his, of refusing to be bullied by those who confused authority with ownership. At dawn, I rowed out to the middle of my section of the lake. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting pink clouds and the silhouettes of pine trees. Along the shore, fish jumped occasionally, sending concentric circles across the surface. This tranquility, this connection to nature, this was what Charles had protected, and now it fell to me to do the same. I spent the rest of the day preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. I made copies of all of the documentation, organized them in clear plastic sleeves, and placed them in a leather portfolio. I rehearsed what I would say, trying to find the balance between firmness and aggression. I didn't want to become the very thing I was fighting against, someone drunk on power and eager to control others. I also took the precaution of setting up a small security camera overlooking my dock, connecting it to my phone so I could document any attempted removal of my property. If this escalated to legal action, I wanted irrefutable evidence of the Homeowners Association's overreach. Just before midnight, the 24-hour deadline approached. I double-checked that my documentation was in order, set my alarm for 4:30 and tried to get some rest. Whatever happened in the morning would set the tone for my future in Lakeside Heights, either as a respected homeowner who stood his ground or as an outcast who dared to challenge the established power structure. The next morning, exactly 4 hours after the towing notice had been placed on my boat, I was ready when the tow truck arrived at 5:15 ante-meridian, and now standing at my dock with Francine Westbrook clutching my eviction notice. With trembling hands, I felt a surge of righteousness that eclipsed any remaining doubt. This is preposterous. Francine sputtered, her composure finally cracking. These papers are meaningless. The association has clear authority. The association, I interrupted calmly, has been exercising authority. It doesn't possess those documents you're holding. Contain copies of the original repair Aryan rights deed, survey maps from the county, assessor, and a cease and desist order prepared by my attorney. You are attempting to remove property from privately owned waters that are not under Homeowners Association jurisdiction. The tow operator, who had been listening intently, suddenly seemed very interested in his clipboard. "Ma'am," he said to Francine, "I'm going to need to see proper authorization if there's a dispute about water rights." "There is no dispute," Francine insisted, her voice rising an octave. This is a clear violation of what? I challenged. Show me where. In your bylaws it states that the association controls the water because I have documentation proving that my uncle purchased exclusive riparian rights to this section of lakefront in 1978, well before Lakeside Heights incorporated as an association. A small crowd had begun to gather by this point. Neighbors in robes and slippers drawn by the unusual early morning commotion. I noticed Hank among them, trying unsuccessfully to suppress a grin. Francine's eyes darted to the onlookers, then back. To me, I could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The board will review these supposed documents and respond accordingly." "Wonderful," I replied in the meantime. "I'll expect all fines to be rescinded, and I'll be keeping my boat right where it is on my legally owned water rights. Oh, and Francine, those notices aren't just for show. If any association representative sets foot on my dock again without permission, I'll pursue trespassing charges." The tow operator had already begun retracting his equipment, clearly wanting no part in what had become a legal dispute. With a curt nod to Francine, he climbed back into his truck and departed, leaving her standing alone at the edge of my property. "This isn't over, Mr. Harrington," she said, attempting to salvage some dignity as she retreated toward her Mercedes. "Actually, Francine," I called after her, "I believe it is." I watched as she drove away, tires crunching on the gravel, a bit faster than necessary. The small crowd of neighbors lingered, murmuring among themselves. I noticed several of them examining the papers I had handed out, copies of the eviction notices containing the evidence of my riparian rights. Hank was the first to approach me. "That was something else," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "Nobody's ever stood up to Francine like that. It wasn't about standing up to her. I clarified it was about protecting what's rightfully mine. There's a difference." As the neighbors dispersed to prepare for their work days, several stopped to shake my hand or pat my shoulder. The atmosphere felt charged, as if something fundamental had shifted in our community. I wondered if Francine could feel it too, or if she was already plotting her counterattack. I didn't have to wait long to find out. That afternoon, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. A thin man in an expensive suit emerged, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than my first car. He introduced himself as Gregory Westbrook, Francine's husband and the Homeowners Association's legal counsel. "Mr. Harrington," he began without preamble, "I thought we might discuss this morning's misunderstanding like reasonable people." I invited him onto my deck, offering coffee, which he declined. Unlike his wife, Gregory was measured and calm, carefully choosing his words. "I've reviewed the documents you provided," he said. "While there appears to be some basis for your position regarding the riparian rights, these matters are rarely as clear-cut as they seem. Lakefront property laws notoriously complex. My attorney seems to think it's quite straightforward in this case," I replied, matching his professional tone. "The deed is explicit and the county records confirm it." Gregory set his briefcase on the table between us, clicking it open to reveal a stack of papers. "The association is prepared to offer a compromise. We'll rescind all current fines and grant you a special exemption for your boat. In exchange, we ask that you sign this acknowledgement of the association's general authority over community waterfront aesthetics for future matters." I took the document he offered but didn't read it. "Let me understand. You want me to sign away my established legal rights in exchange for permission to do what I already have the right to do?" A slight twitch in his jaw was the only indication that my response had irritated him. "We're trying to avoid a protracted legal battle that would benefit no one. Litigation costs alone would exceed any Reasonable outcome value. I agree completely. I said, sliding the document back across the table, which is why I won't be signing anything that undermines my property rights or sets a precedent for the association to harass me in the future. Gregory studied me for a moment, likely reassessing his approach. You're new to our community, Mr. Harrington. There's a certain harmony we've established over the years. One resident's defiance can upset the balance that makes Lakeside Heights such a desirable place to live. I've noticed your version of harmony, I replied. It seems to involve a lot of threatening letters and arbitrary enforcement. I prefer a different kind, one where people respect actual property boundaries and legal rights. He closed his briefcase with a sharp click. This is unfortunate. The board was hoping for an amicable resolution. So was I assured him. My resolution was simple: acknowledge my riparian rights and leave my boat alone. Instead, you sent a tow truck at dawn as Gregory drove away. I wondered if I had just made a powerful enemy. The Westbrooks clearly weren't accustomed to losing, and I doubted they would accept defeat easily. My suspicion was confirmed the next morning when I found a new notice in my mailbox, not from the Homeowners Association directly, but from the Cedar Lake Environmental Commission, citing concerns about unauthorized moorings potentially damaging sensitive shoreline ecosystems. The letter requested that I attend a hearing the following week to address these supposed violations. It didn't take much investigation to discover that Francine Westbrook sat on the Environmental Commission's board of directors. She had simply changed tactics, looking for another angle of attack. I immediately called Sarah, who was unsurprised by this development. Classic redirect. She explained, when they can't win on one front, they open another. But this is actually good news. It means they know they can't beat you on the property rights issue. Sarah drafted a response to the Environmental Commission, including documentation from state environmental authorities confirming that private docks like mine posed no ecological threat when properly maintained. She also included a formal request for Francine to recuse herself from any matters involving my property due to the obvious conflict of interest. 2 days later, I received a brief email from the Environmental Commission. The hearing had been indefinitely postponed, pending review of jurisdictional matters. Another victory. But I remained wary. This pattern of harassment seemed unlikely to stop entirely. The following week was surprisingly quiet. No new notices appeared in my mailbox, and the Homeowners Association's official website suddenly showed my outstanding fines as under review. I continued to use my boat freely, taking evening cruises around the lake and even hosting a small gathering for Hank and a few other neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation. Word spread quickly. Through Lakeside Heights, residents I'd never met before would wave from their yards or stop me in the local market to express support. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had grown weary of the association's heavy-handed tactics 10 days after. The towing attempt, a certified letter arrived from the County Land Management Office. Inside was an official notice directed to the Lakeside Heights Homeowners Association, confirming that their attempted regulation of private repair area and water rights constituted an overreach of authority. The county had reviewed the documentation my attorney had submitted and formally recognized the validity of my uncle's original water rights deed. More significantly, the letter ordered the association to cease all enforcement activities related to lakefront properties where similar deeds might exist, pending a comprehensive review of water boundaries throughout Cedar Lake. That same afternoon, a separate letter arrived from the association itself, a tour notification that all fines against my property had been administratively cancelled and that the board would be revisiting certain aspects of the community bylaws at the next quarterly meeting. I was savoring this victory on my dock that evening, watching the sunset with a celebrated glass of whiskey, when Hank wandered over from his property. You've caused quite the stir. he said, nodding toward the clubhouse across the lake, where lights blazed from the windows despite the late hour. "Word is they're holding an emergency board meeting about water rights," I asked. Hank chuckled about everything. Apparently after the county got involved, several other homeowners started questioning different aspects of the association's authority. The Michael Elsons are talking about rebuilding their gazebo. The Wilsons on Cedar Point are installing the dock extension they've wanted for years. I hadn't anticipated this ripple effect, but it made perfect sense once people realized that the association's power wasn't absolute. Years of accumulated resentment over petty restrictions had bubbled to the surface. "Do you think Francine will resign?" I asked, offering Hank a seat. He shook his head, not willingly, but there's already talk of a special election to replace board members. People are saying it's time for new leadership, someone who will focus on maintaining the community rather than controlling it. The following morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Harold Bennett, one of the original developers of Lakeside Heights, and now well into his 80s, knocked on my door just after 9. I recognized him from community events, though we had never spoken directly. "Young man," he said, "when I invited him in, I wanted to thank you personally for what you're doing." I offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully, and we sat in my kitchen overlooking the lake I built. "The first 20 homes in this community in 1972, he explained, his hands slightly trembling as he held his mug. The vision was for a place where people could enjoy the natural beauty of Cedar Lake while maintaining certain standards of appearance and behavior. Reasonable standards. He sighed, deeply gazing out at the water. The Homeowners Association was meant to be a caretaker, not a dictator, somewhere along the way that got lost these past few years, especially with Francine and her crowd running things. It's not what we intended. I was moved by his sincerity. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, Mr. Bennett. I just want to enjoy my property." "That's exactly the point," he said, nodding vigorously. "A community thrives when people feel ownership, real ownership of their homes and their lives. These excessive restrictions, these punitive fines, they create resentment, not harmony." Before leaving, Harold shared something invaluable: the original community charter preserved in a leather binder he had kept all these years. The document explicitly stated that the association's purpose was to maintain common areas, enforce reasonable aesthetic standards, and promote neighborly cooperation. Nowhere did it mention the kind of micromanagement that had become Francine's trademark. "May I borrow this?" I asked, an idea forming. Harold nodded. "Use it well, son. Some of us old-timers have been waiting for someone to help set things right." That evening, I scanned the charter and emailed copies to several neighbors who had expressed support. Within days, an informal gathering took place at Hank's house. 15 residents who shared frustrations about the association's overreach. We discussed the charter, the riparian rights issue, and other examples of Francine's selective enforcement. "It's not just about boats and docks," said Eleanor Williams, a retired school teacher who had lived on Cedar Point for over 2 decades, last spring. "They fined me $300 because my eyelets were non-conforming colors. They were the same eyelets I've had since 1995. Similar stories emerged from around the table. Arbitrary rulings, inconsistent enforcement, personal vendettas, thinly disguised as community standards. What had begun as my individual stand against towing my boat had evolved into something larger, a grassroots movement to reclaim the neighborhood from those who had weaponized the Homeowners Association for personal power. By the end of the evening, we had formed an informal committee with a simple mission: restore the original intent of the Lakeside Heights Charter and ensure fair, transparent governance. We called ourselves the Lakeside Restoration Committee. A deliberate echo of Harold Bennett's founding vision. Word traveled quickly. Within days, our email list included over 40 households. Nearly a third of the community people began displaying small blue flags on their mailboxes, a subtle signal of solidarity that nonetheless sent a clear message to the board. Something had changed in Lakeside Heights, and it wouldn't be easily reversed. Francine's response was predictably defensive. A community-wide email went out decrying divisive elements and irresponsible challenges to necessary standards. The message reinforced the board's commitment to maintaining property values through consistent enforcement and warned that chaos would ensue if individual preferences were permitted to override community guidelines. But her words rang hollow against the backdrop of the original charter and the growing awareness of her selective enforcement. Even some of her traditional supporters began to question whether the current approach had gone too far. 3 weeks after my confrontation with Francine and the tow operator, the Lakeside Heights Homeowners Association held its scheduled monthly meeting. Normally, these gatherings attracted only the most dedicated community members, perhaps 15 or 20 residents. At most that evening, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed with cars, and extra chairs had to be brought in to accommodate nearly 100 homeowners, who showed up to voice their opinions. I arrived early and took a seat near the back. Curious, but not wanting to appear smug, the tension in the room was palpable as Francine called the meeting to order. Her usual confidence notably diminished before. "We address regular business," she began stiffly. "The board has prepared a statement regarding recent developments concerning waterfront regulations." What followed was clearly a carefully crafted statement that had been vetted by lawyers. Francine explained that after new information had come to light regarding historical property rights on Cedar Lake, the board had voted to amend the community bylaws effective immediately. All regulations pertaining to docks, boats, and waterfront structures would be rescinded for properties with deed. The announcement was met with murmurs of approval, but it was what happened next that truly signaled the change in Lakeside Heights. Gerald McKenna, a retired judge who had lived on the lake for over 30 years, stood up from his seat in the front row. "Madame President," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "While I appreciate the board's responsiveness to this particular issue, it seems clear that a more comprehensive review of association powers is warranted. I move that we establish an independent committee of homeowners to evaluate all current bylaws and recommend appropriate limitations on board authority." The motion was seconded instantly by at least a dozen voices when Francine reluctantly called for a vote. Nearly every hand in the room shot up. In support, as the meeting continued, 3 board members, including Francine's most loyal supporters, announced their immediate resignations. The community secretary read their prepared statements, each citing personal reasons for stepping down, but everyone understood the real cause. The power dynamic in Lakeside Heights had shifted permanently. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours as residents voiced long-suppressed grievances and suggestions for reform. When the time came to elect interim replacements for the resigned board members, the results were telling. Each new member had signed on with our Lakeside Restoration Committee. Francine remained as president, at least nominally, but her power base had eroded significantly as she adjourned. The meeting, her usual commanding tone, was replaced by something that bordered on conciliatory. For the first time since I'd moved to Lakeside Heights, she actually thanked residents for their participation and promised to consider all viewpoints. In future decisions, as people filed out of the clubhouse, Harold Bennett found me in the crowd. His eyes were misty as he gripped my hand. 50 years I've lived here," he said. "Tonight reminds me of our very first community meeting back when we were building something we could be proud of. Thank you for helping bring that spirit back." In the days following the meeting, the community began to heal. The ubiquitous, threatening letters ceased. The website was updated to reflect a more balanced approach to rule enforcement, with a new emphasis on community consultation. Before major decisions, a suggestion box appeared in the clubhouse, and an online forum was established for residents to discuss neighborhood matters openly. Even Francine showed signs of adaptation, if not genuine change of heart. I encountered her at the community mailboxes one afternoon, and instead of her usual icy glare, she offered a stiff nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship, but it was a start. "Nice day on the lake," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "It is," I agreed. "Perfect boating weather." A flicker of the old defensiveness crossed her face, but she suppressed it. "The board is drafting new guidelines for waterfront properties," she said. "We'd appreciate your input, given your research on the matter." It was as close to an olive branch as Francine Westbrook was capable of extending. I accepted it. With grace, I'd be happy to share what I've learned. The goal should be clarity for everyone, don't you think? She nodded curtly and walked away, but the significance of the exchange wasn't lost on me. The rigid hierarchy was giving way to something more collaborative. Even if reluctantly, the following Saturday afternoon, I was waxing Freedom's Hall when a tentative voice called from the shoreline, "Excuse me, Mr. Harrington." I turned to find a young couple standing at the edge of my property looking uncertain. Recognized them as the Fosters, who had moved into a small ranch-style home on the other side of the community just a month before I had arrived. "We're sorry to bother you," the woman said, "but we heard you might be able to help us. We've been fined 3 times for the children's swing set in our backyard. The association says it exceeds the height restriction, but we measured carefully before installation. We wondered if you might have advice about well standing up to them." I set down my polishing cloth and invited them onto my deck as we talked. I realized that my confrontation with the association had done more than protect my own property rights. It had given hope to others who had felt powerless against arbitrary rules and selective enforcement. By midsummer, the transformation of Lakeside Heights was remarkable. The independent committee Judge McKinney had proposed was diligently reviewing the association's authority with a focus on balancing community standards with individual property rights. 3 new board members had been elected, each running on platforms of transparency and reasonable governance. Most visibly, the lake itself had come alive again. Docks that had stood empty for years now hosted pontoon boats, kayaks and fishing skiffs. Children splashed in previously quiet coves, and weekend barbecues dotted the shoreline. The community felt vibrant rather than oppressive. As for my boat freedom, she remained exactly where she belonged. Moored to my dock, bobbing gently in the water that my uncle had the foresight to secure. Decades earlier, I had added just one small modification: a new decorative plaque mounted on her stern, visible to anyone passing by on the lake. It read simply, "Eviction Notice."